So Charlotte, it's been suggested that modern businesses have far less need for capital. So even if they had a right to primacy over stakeholders, other stakeholders, they no longer deserve that right. What's your view on that?
So I can understand why that view has come about in terms of sort of technology companies. Often they wouldn't really need the bigger infrastructure or the pieces that are quite costly initially. However, there still seems to be a need for businesses. A lot of what I do is working with organizations that are providing capital, and there still is a constant flow of like loan portfolios of people wanting finance for various things. Having been a banker since '82, my feeling is not that it's less.
So does it depend on the type and size of the business we're talking about, do you think?
I think it absolutely does. I mean, we have to be clear on what our assumptions are before we have these discussions, for sure, because we look at companies in all different kind of ways. And when you have a global, say, construction company, obviously they will just need access to financing to keep going, because it's kind of a finance-heavy industry where a technology company would not have that same need. But that doesn't mean that both of them shouldn't look at stakeholders in its broader context, because the fundamental bottom line for all of us is that people, planet, and prosperity counts equally. We can't just look at financial gains or profit. It just doesn't fly anymore, because in the end of the day, without people and planet, no organization is going to survive. And it's that clarity we have to start all our strategic planning from, in my view. Originating from Scandinavia, I have for decades been looking at Scandinavian businesses and working now with Scandinavian private equity. There is a way of making money whilst you take everything into account. Whether the board should leave that to the executives or not, I think the board and the executives should always work very closely together. And they should together realize that there is a need for that broader look at all stakeholders and not just focus on shareholders. This has been unsustainable in Scandinavia for many years, and we could in fact learn a lot from some knowledge transfer from the Scandinavian countries over to other countries. I think we need more enlightened people, full stop, in the world, right? It needs to be all of us moving up to a higher level of cognitive understanding, if you want. I think as humanity, we are clearly in front of a huge crisis where we are effectively killing ourselves. It might take a couple of 100 years, but we are killing ourselves. If we don't elevate our thinking, nobody will survive. And I think that is the core point. The short-term focus has got to be 100 to 200 years focus instead of 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this timeline issue, what we mean by long-term really matters, and it's very rarely defined.
That's right. I mean, it's defined like on the listed companies, you have the viability statement where we had to go beyond the 12 months and look further into 3 years to 5 years. But hardly any listed companies went beyond 5 years, which is still, in my world, short-termism, right? But we need much longer view on where we are going with some clear points of what we're going to achieve. Climate change is trying that with chapter 0 to say, when will we be at 0? But then they introduce things like carbon offset, which actually destroys the whole picture, right? Because that is not going to bring us to the right place in time.
How do we bring about the change? Is it going to require change in, for example, the big topic is the way executives are incentivized and executive pay, for example?
I think there has to be KPIs that are feeding in towards a much broader group. It's not just a profit KPI. It's also about, lots of other things like diversity. Again, if we don't bring cognitive diverse thinking into our decision-making processes, we're going to go nowhere. So I think where we are today could be potentially a picture of having a very small, homogeneous kind of people making decisions for everyone. And those decisions have not been well thought through. So we have to acknowledge that has happened and that progress was not progress. Plastic bottles might have felt like progress, but that is now part of the problem. So not all progress is progress, and that's about bringing the right people into the decision-making process. So there has to be a rapid shift in that area, in my view, for us to start making different decisions based on a much broader insight and amount of eyes to see as many unknown unknowns as we can possibly see.
So in what you've just said, you cover a few different issues in the sense of organizational structure, decision-making process, who's involved in that process, and the incentives that are in place.
That's right.
Okay, so all of those issues need to be really reconsidered, yeah.
And obviously, if we take a long term, in my kind of long term, 100 years and more, then we have to change all education, because we have to educate children from when they're very young in that broader sustainability, which is not part of the current curriculum in sufficient amounts. It's also not part of like director development programs in sufficient amounts, and that needs to happen rapidly too.
So in her book, Judy Samuelson says that, you know, some businesses are awake to the changes, the new rules, as she calls them, that are taking place. But she says that even with enlightened leaders, companies with public shareholders manage on a tightrope, is the way she describes it. So they stay attuned to the noisy demands of the short-term investors and the outright threats of some of them, while prioritizing the strategic investments needed to create value for those that are in it for the long haul. Do you think that's true in your experience? I mean, that sounds like a massive challenge.
Well, it is a challenge when you serve on the board of a listed company. You will always have those challenges. I'm doing my 10th IPO now for over the last 15 years, and it will always be a challenge. However, the activism I have seen over those 15 years, and before that, by the way, I worked with 4 different activist investors, so I know how they think and what they go for. The kind of things they have activism against is more like the wrong governance, making the wrong decisions, and not doing the best for the organization. But today we have activism within not ensuring that we are not polluting, that we're, you know, the social activism is much more from the shareholders, always increasing massively, to just looking at the bottom line. And I think it's different conversations we have with shareholders around sustainability, and both financially, socially, and environmentally. And I think the shareholders I speak to are clear on those 3 areas, all needing to be sustainable. It's not just financial sustainability anymore.